Young Jamal approaches Santa with a heartfelt letter, hoping to connect with his soldier father stationed far away. But when the jaded mall Santa mocks his request, Jamal's world shatters. Write in the comment where you watching this video from. The mall was alive with holiday cheer, the air filled with the sounds of Christmas carols and the chatter of shoppers hustling for last-minute deals. Glittering decorations hung from every surface, with giant candy canes and twinkling snowflakes suspended from the ceiling. Santa's village was the centerpiece, a massive display of red and green with faux snow blanketing the floor and twinkling lights outlining the sleigh and reindeer. Children lined up with their parents, their faces filled with anticipation as they waited to meet Santa. Jamal stood at the edge of the display, clutching a neatly folded piece of paper in his small hands. He had written the letter 3 nights ago, sitting at the kitchen table under the soft glow of their only lamp. His mother had helped him with some of the spelling, but the words were entirely his own. It wasn't a long letter, but it carried all the love and hope in his heart. "Go on, Jamal," his mother Nicole urged gently. She knelt beside him, adjusting his jacket against the chill of the air-conditioned mall. Her voice was soft but encouraging. "You've been talking about this all week. Santa's waiting." Jamal hesitated, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Do you think he'll listen, Mama?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nicole smiled, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Of course, baby. He listens to all the children. Just tell him what's in your heart." Jamal nodded slowly, tightening his grip on the letter. He looked at the line of children, each one eagerly stepping forward to sit on Santa's lap. Some of them were laughing, others were crying, but all of them had lists of toys and games they hoped to see under the tree. Jamal's wish was different. He didn't want a video game or a bike. He just wanted his dad. The man in the red suit, Bill, was in his 5th year of playing Santa Claus at the mall. To most people, he looked the part. Stout, with a full white beard, partially real, partially fake, and a booming laugh when he remembered to use it. But Bill wasn't feeling particularly jolly today. He had been on the job since 10 a.m., and by now his patience was wearing thin. The endless requests for expensive toys and gadgets grated on him, reminding him of everything he couldn't afford in his own life. Bill adjusted his hat and waved the next child forward, forcing a smile. "Ho, ho, ho! Come on up," he said, his tone more mechanical than cheerful. Jamal shuffled forward, clutching his letter tightly. His small sneakers squeaked against the polished mall floor as he climbed onto Santa's lap. Bill glanced at him, taking in the boy's nervous expression and his carefully pressed but well-worn clothes. "What's your name, little guy?" Bill asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Jamal," the boy said quietly. His hands trembled as he extended the letter. "I wrote this for you, Santa." Bill took the letter, raising an eyebrow. "A letter, huh? Let's see what we've got here." He unfolded the paper, the creases sharp from being folded so carefully. His eyes scanned the neat handwriting. "Dear Santa, I don't want toys or games this year. I just want my dad to come home. He's a soldier and he's really far away. If you can't bring him, please send this letter to him so he knows I love him. Thank you, Jamal." For a moment, Bill didn't say anything. The noise of the mall faded into the background as he reread the letter. Something about the simplicity and sincerity of the words caught him off guard, stirring a flicker of emotion he hadn't felt in years. But instead of letting that feeling take root, he pushed it aside. "Well, kid," Bill said, letting out a short, sharp laugh. "This is ambitious." Jamal blinked, unsure what he meant. "You know Santa doesn't work miracles, right?" Bill continued, handing the letter back. "I mean, your dad's in the army. That's not something I can fix with a sleigh and reindeer." Jamal's face fell. "But I thought you could." Bill cut him off, his voice growing impatient. "Look, kid, maybe ask for something Santa can actually bring, like a toy truck or a new game. This whole bring my dad home thing? That's not how it works." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Jamal's small hands clutched the letter tightly as his eyes filled with tears. He slid off Santa's lap and stood there for a moment, staring at the man who had just dismissed his deepest wish. "Thanks anyway," Jamal whispered, his voice trembling. He turned and ran back to his mother, his shoulders hunched as he tried to hold back his tears. In line behind Jamal was Mrs. Whitaker, a sharp-eyed elderly woman with a red coat and an aura of authority. She had come to the mall that day to pick up a few gifts for the children at the community center where she volunteered. Watching Jamal's interaction with Santa, she felt a surge of anger rise within her. As the boy ran off, Mrs. Whitaker stepped forward, fixing Bill with a piercing glare. "You should be ashamed of yourself," she said, her voice low but firm. Bill blinked, startled by her tone. "Excuse me? You heard me," Mrs. Whitaker said. "That boy poured his heart into that letter, and you crushed him. What kind of Santa does that?" Bill sighed, leaning back in his oversized chair. "Lady, I'm just doing my job. I can't make every kid's wish come true." "Your job," Mrs. Whitaker snapped, "is to bring a little magic into their lives. That boy wasn't asking for a toy or a game. He was asking for hope. And you stomped all over it." Her words stung, though Bill wouldn't admit it. "Look, it's not my fault the kid doesn't understand how the world works," he muttered. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "Maybe it's you who doesn't understand. That boy doesn't need a toy. He needs someone to believe in him. And you had the chance to be that someone, but you threw it away." She turned sharply on her heel and walked away, leaving Bill to sit in silence, her words ringing in his ears. Jamal reached his mother, who knelt down to meet him. "Baby, what's wrong?" Nicole asked, her voice filled with concern. Jamal handed her the letter, his hands trembling. "Santa, he said it wasn't real. That he couldn't help." Nicole read the letter, her heart sinking as she realized what had happened. She pulled Jamal into a tight hug, her eyes welling with tears. "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry." Jamal buried his face in her shoulder, his small frame shaking. Nicole stroked his back gently, her heart breaking for her son. She wanted to storm back to Santa's village and give that man a piece of her mind, but she knew it wouldn't erase the hurt he had caused. Instead, she whispered, "Your letter is beautiful, Jamal, and your daddy would love it. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." Jamal nodded against her shoulder, his tears soaking into her coat. "Do you think Daddy will ever come home?" he asked, his voice muffled. Nicole swallowed hard, willing herself to stay strong. "I do, baby. And until then, we'll keep hoping. Okay? Okay," Jamal whispered. As Nicole guided Jamal toward the mall exit, Mrs. Whitaker spotted them from across the food court. Her heart ached at the sight of the boy's tear-streaked face. She didn't know exactly what she could do, but she knew she had to try. "Excuse me," she called out, hurrying toward them. "Ma'am." Nicole turned, her expression wary. "Yes. My name is Mrs. Whitaker," the older woman said, her voice gentle. "I saw what happened back there, and I just wanted to say, I'm so sorry. Your son's letter, it's beautiful. And I'd like to help if I can." Nicole hesitated, unsure what to make of the stranger's offer. But when she looked into Mrs. Whitaker's kind eyes, she felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you," Nicole said softly. "I don't know what we need, but thank you." Mrs. Whitaker smiled, patting Jamal gently on the shoulder. "Don't worry, young man. We'll figure something out. You'll see." The bus ride home was quiet, except for the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of shopping bags from other passengers. Jamal sat next to his mother, staring out the window as the city lights flickered past. The crumpled letter was still clutched tightly in his hand, the edges frayed and smudged with tears he had tried to wipe away. Nicole watched her son carefully, her heart aching at his silence. Jamal had always been a bright, talkative child, but now his shoulders slumped, and his usual spark seemed dimmed. "Baby," Nicole said softly, reaching over to touch his hand. "Talk to me. What happened back there?" Jamal didn't look at her. His voice was barely audible over the sound of the bus. "Santa didn't like my letter. He said it wasn't real." Nicole's chest tightened. "What do you mean, not real?" Jamal shrugged, his fingers tracing the creases of the paper. He said Santa can't bring people back from the army, that I should ask for toys instead. Like my letter didn't matter. Nicole bit her lip, anger and sadness swirling inside her. She wanted to march back to that mall and give that so-called Santa a piece of her mind. But right now, Jamal needed her more than her anger did. She pulled him close, wrapping an arm around his small shoulders. Jamal, listen to me. Your letter matters. Your words matter. Don't let anyone make you feel like they don't. Jamal leaned into her, silent but comforted by her warmth. The apartment building was old, its brick exterior weathered and cracked. Inside, the halls smelled faintly of floor cleaner and cooking. Nicole unlocked the door to their small unit and ushered Jamal inside. The space was modest but cozy. A tiny living room with a worn couch, a kitchen just big enough for a small table, and a miniature Christmas tree twinkling in the corner. Jamal walked straight to the couch and sat down, the letter still in his hand. Nicole followed him, kneeling in front of him so she could look him in the eye. Jamal, you know what your letter means, right? She asked. Jamal looked down at the paper, his lip trembling. It's for Daddy. I just wanted him to know I love him. Nicole's heart broke. She took the letter gently from his hand, smoothing out the wrinkles as best she could. Your dad loves you so much, Jamal, and he knows you love him too. This letter is beautiful, and it's special because it came from your heart. Jamal sniffled, looking up at her. Do you think he'll get it? Nicole smiled through her tears. I know he will. We'll find a way to make sure he does. That evening, after dinner, Nicole tucked Jamal into bed. He lay under a patchwork quilt that had once belonged to his father, the fabric worn but comforting. Beside his bed was a photo of Sergeant Marcus Hill in uniform, his smile wide and proud. Tell me a story about Daddy, Jamal said, his voice small in the dim light. Nicole sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers gently brushing his hair. Okay, did I ever tell you about the time your dad stayed up all night building your crib? Jamal shook his head, his eyes wide with curiosity. Well, Nicole began. When we found out you were coming, your dad was so excited. He wanted to make sure everything was perfect. One night, a big box showed up at the door. It was the crib we'd ordered, but it came with a million little pieces and instructions as long as a book. Jamal giggled at the image of his dad wrestling with crib parts. Your dad wouldn't let me help, Nicole continued. He said, I've got this. I want my son to know his daddy built him a strong crib. So he stayed up all night, putting it together piece by piece. By morning, it was done. And you slept in it every night until you got too big. Jamal smiled, his eyes heavy with sleep. Daddy's the best, he murmured. Nicole leaned down and kissed his forehead. Yes, he is. And you're just like him. Across town, Mrs. Whitaker sat in her small apartment, the events of the day replaying in her mind. She couldn't shake the image of Jamal's face when that awful Santa had dismissed his letter. The boy's pain had struck a chord deep within her. Her husband had been a soldier too long ago. He had served in World War II, and though he had returned home safely, she knew the toll it had taken on him, and on their family. She remembered the letters she had written to him during his deployment, pouring her heart onto paper and waiting weeks for his replies. Those letters had been a lifeline, a connection that had kept their love strong despite the miles between them. Jamal's letter had the same kind of love, the same kind of hope, and it had been mocked. Mrs. Whitaker stood up, her resolve hardening. She grabbed her coat and headed for the community center where she volunteered. If anyone could help her find Jamal and his mother, it was the network of families she worked with there. At the community center, Mrs. Whitaker found Carla, the cheerful receptionist who seemed to know everyone in the neighborhood. Carla, Mrs. Whitaker said, her tone urgent. I need your help. There's a boy named Jamal. He came to the mall yesterday with his mother. I need to find them. Carla frowned in thought. Jamal Hill? I think I know them. His mom, Nicole, comes here sometimes. Why are you looking for them? Mrs. Whitaker explained what had happened, her voice shaking with indignation as she recounted the way Bill had treated Jamal. I need to make it right, she said firmly. Carla nodded. I'll give Nicole a call. If anyone can fix this, Mrs. Whitaker, it's you. Back at the Hills apartment, Nicole sat at the kitchen table, staring at Jamal's letter. The boy had fallen asleep clutching his father's photo, and the sight had brought fresh tears to her eyes. She thought about all the nights Marcus had missed. Birthdays, school plays, and now another Christmas. The phone rang, breaking her thoughts. Nicole picked it up, surprised to hear Mrs. Whitaker's voice on the other end. Nicole, Mrs. Whitaker began. I hope I'm not bothering you. My name is Agnes Whitaker, and I was at the mall yesterday when that Santa behaved the way he did. I'm calling because I want to help. Nicole hesitated, unsure of what to say. I know how much that letter means to Jamal, and to you, Mrs. Whitaker continued. And I think we can find a way to make sure it reaches his father. If you'll let me, I'd like to meet with you tomorrow to talk about it. Nicole's initial wariness gave way to cautious hope. Okay, she said finally. Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow. That night, as Jamal slept, Nicole sat by the glowing Christmas tree, her heart heavy but her resolve stronger than ever. She couldn't erase what had happened at the mall, but with Mrs. Whitaker's help, maybe she could turn things around for her son. She looked at the letter, now carefully smoothed and placed in a protective folder. We'll get this to him, Jamal, she whispered. We'll make sure he knows. In the stillness of the night, the soft glow of the tree lights seemed to echo her silent promise. After a long day of playing Santa, Bill slumped into the chair in the staff room, tugging at the red and white costume that clung to him uncomfortably. The fake beard lay discarded on the table, its once fluffy fibers now flattened from hours of wear. The staff room was small and dimly lit, with a single fluorescent bulb flickering in one corner. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning products. Bill leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and rubbing his face with his hands. His reflection in the dusty mirror caught his attention. The face that stared back at him looked older than his 48 years. Deep lines etched across his forehead, dark circles under his eyes, and a perpetual scowl that seemed to have become his default expression. Santa Claus, he muttered bitterly, shaking his head. What a joke. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the mall's cleaning crew outside. But in the stillness, Bill couldn't escape the memory of Jamal's face. The boy's wide eyes, brimming with tears, had been haunting him since the moment he dismissed the letter. He tried to shake the image from his mind, but it lingered, gnawing at him. Why do I even care? Bill mumbled to himself, his voice rough. It's just a kid and a letter. Happens every day. Bill leaned back in the chair, letting his thoughts drift to a time when Christmas had meant something to him. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment, he was back in the tiny house he and Eleanor had shared. The smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air as the two of them decorated their modest living room, stringing popcorn garlands and hanging paper snowflakes in the windows. Do you think we'll ever afford one of those fancy trees? Eleanor had asked, her laughter light and teasing. Bill had grinned, hanging another ornament on their small, slightly lopsided tree. One day, when I'm a big-shot writer and we've got money to burn. Eleanor had rolled her eyes playfully. Big-shot writer or not, I like our tree just fine. It's got heart. She had always been like that, seeing the good in everything, even when life was far from perfect. Bill had spent countless nights sitting by the fire with her, reading her the stories he had written. She had listened intently, her eyes lighting up with every twist and turn of his tales. You've got a gift, Bill, she had said often. Don't ever give up on it. But he had given up. When Eleanor fell ill, their focus shifted entirely to hospital visits and medical bills. The typewriter was the first thing to go, then the books, and finally their home. By the time she passed, Bill was left with nothing but her wedding ring and a mountain of debt. He had tried to write after her death, but the words wouldn't come. Every blank page felt like a failure, a reminder of what he had lost. Dreams are for suckers, Bill muttered now, his voice tinged with bitterness. Over the years, Bill had built a wall around himself, brick by brick, to keep the world out. The jobs he took were transactional, seasonal gigs that required minimal effort and even less emotional investment. Being Santa Claus at the mall was just another paycheck, a way to keep the lights on in his dingy apartment. He didn't hate kids, but he didn't feel much for them either. Their endless lists of toys and gadgets felt shallow, and he dismissed their excitement as the naivety of youth. But Jamal had been different. The boy's letter wasn't filled with demands for toys or games. It was raw, heartfelt, and painfully sincere, and instead of honoring that, Bill had stomped on it. He hadn't meant to be cruel, but he had been. And now, for reasons he couldn't quite understand, it bothered him. That night, Bill lay awake in his small apartment. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. The hum of traffic outside was a constant background noise, but it wasn't what kept him up. The letter, Jamal's letter. He replayed the words in his mind. I just want my dad to come home. If you can't bring him, please send this letter to him so he knows I love him. Bill sat up in bed, running a hand through his thinning hair. He hadn't thought about love or hope in years. To him, those concepts had become empty platitudes, things other people clung to because they didn't know any better. But this little boy, had written something so pure, so filled with love, that it had managed to crack the wall Bill had spent years building around his heart. Damn kid, he muttered, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the floor. Damn letter. The next day, Bill arrived at the mall early, hoping to push Jamal's letter from his mind by throwing himself into his routine. But no sooner had he stepped into the staff room than Mrs. Whitaker appeared in the doorway, her red coat as bright as ever. You and I need to talk, she said, her tone firm. Bill sighed, already knowing what this was about. Look, lady, I don't need a lecture. Oh, you need more than a lecture, Mrs. Whitaker said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. What you did to that boy yesterday was beyond unacceptable. Do you have any idea what his letter was about? Bill folded his arms across his chest, his expression guarded. I read the letter. I know what it was about. Then you know it was for his father, a soldier deployed overseas, Mrs. Whitaker snapped. That boy isn't asking for a toy or a game. He's asking for something real. And instead of honoring that, you dismissed him like he didn't matter. Her words hit harder than Bill cared to admit. He looked away, the memory of Jamal's tearful face flashing through his mind. I didn't mean to hurt him, Bill muttered. I didn't think. That's your problem, Mrs. Whitaker shot back. You've stopped thinking, stopped caring. But it's not too late to fix this. Bill glanced at her, skeptical. And how exactly am I supposed to do that? Mrs. Whitaker stepped closer, her voice softening. You start by apologizing. And then you help me make sure that boy's letter reaches his father. You've been given a second chance, Bill. Don't waste it. Bill stared at her for a long moment. Part of him wanted to push her away, to say it wasn't his problem. But another part, the part that remembered Eleanor's faith in him, made him pause. What if I don't know how? He asked quietly. Mrs. Whitaker smiled, her eyes twinkling with determination. You let me show you. That night, Bill sat in his apartment with a copy of Jamal's letter in his hand. Mrs. Whitaker had given it to him, insisting he read it again. The words, so simple and yet so profound, brought a lump to his throat. For the first time in years, he felt something other than bitterness. He felt a spark, a tiny ember of hope. He picked up a pen and a blank sheet of paper. Slowly, hesitantly, he began to write. Not a story this time, but a letter of his own. A letter to himself, promising that he would try to be better. Mrs. Whitaker was no stranger to taking matters into her own hands. As a retired teacher and a lifelong advocate for her community, she believed in action over idle talk. After leaving the mall with a heart heavy from witnessing Jamal's pain, she went home and made herself a cup of chamomile tea. Sitting in her cozy living room surrounded by bookshelves and family photographs, she unfolded Jamal's crumpled letter again. The words on the page tugged at her heartstrings with a force she hadn't felt in years. This boy needs hope, she murmured. And I'll be damned if I let someone take that away from him. The next morning, bundled in her red coat and sensible boots, Mrs. Whitaker headed to the community center. It wasn't just a hub for activities. It was the heartbeat of the neighborhood, a place where connections were made and lives were changed. Carla, the community center's receptionist, was organizing donation bins when Mrs. Whitaker arrived. The center smelled of coffee, crayons, and the faint tang of floor cleaner. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker." Carla greeted her with a smile. "What brings you in today?" "Carla, I need your help," Mrs. Whitaker said, pulling Jamal's letter from her bag. "I'm trying to find a family. The boy's name is Jamal, and his mother's name is Nicole. Do you know them?" Carla tilted her head in thought, her brow furrowing. "Jamal Hill? Yes, I think I know them. Nicole comes here sometimes for workshops, and Jamal has been in our after-school programs. Why are you looking for them?" Mrs. Whitaker explained the events at the mall, her voice trembling as she recounted Jamal's humiliation and the boy's earnest desire to connect with his father. Carla's expression softened. "That poor boy," Carla said. "Nicole's mentioned how much he misses his dad. She's been trying to keep him strong, but I know it hasn't been easy for them. Can you help me contact her?" Mrs. Whitaker asked, her tone urgent. Carla nodded. "I can't give you her number directly, but I'll call her for you. If she's okay with it, I'll connect you." Within hours, Nicole agreed to meet Mrs. Whitaker, albeit hesitantly. She didn't know much about the older woman but appreciated her concern. When Mrs. Whitaker arrived at the Hills' modest apartment, she was struck by the warmth of the space. Despite its small size, the living room was filled with love. Framed photographs of Jamal's father in uniform, handmade Christmas decorations, and a tiny tree that sparkled with mismatched lights. Nicole greeted her at the door, her expression cautious but polite. Jamal sat on the couch, his sketchbook in hand, his head snapping up at the sight of their visitor. "Mrs. Whitaker, right?" Nicole asked, stepping aside to let her in. "Yes, thank you for having me," Mrs. Whitaker said, taking off her gloves. Nicole gestured toward the couch, where Jamal was now sitting upright, his eyes filled with curiosity. "Jamal," Nicole said gently, "this is Mrs. Whitaker. She wanted to talk to us about your letter." Mrs. Whitaker knelt slightly to meet Jamal's eye level, pulling his letter from her bag. "Hi, Jamal. I saw you at the mall the other day. I read your letter, and I want you to know something. It's a beautiful letter. Your dad would be so proud of you." Jamal's eyes widened, and he glanced at his mom as if asking for reassurance. Nicole nodded, encouraging him to speak. "Do you think my dad will get it?" Jamal asked, his voice small. "I think he will," Mrs. Whitaker said firmly. "But I'll need your help to make sure of it. Would you be okay with that?" Jamal nodded slowly, his grip on his sketchbook loosening. Nicole sat across from Mrs. Whitaker, her hands clasped tightly. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, her tone wary. "I have a friend who works for the Daily Chronicle," Mrs. Whitaker explained. "She writes about community stories, things that bring people together. If we share Jamal's letter, it might reach someone who can help get it to his father." Nicole hesitated, her protective instincts kicking in. "I don't want Jamal's letter to become some kind of spectacle. This is personal." "I understand," Mrs. Whitaker said, "and I promise we'll handle it with care. But sometimes, sharing a little of ourselves can inspire others." And Jamal's words, his love for his father, could bring hope to so many people. Nicole looked at Jamal. "What do you think, baby? Do you want to share your letter?" Jamal thought for a moment before nodding. If it helps Daddy, then yes. 2 days later, Nicole and Jamal met Mrs. Whitaker's journalist friend, Margaret, at the Daily Chronicle office. Margaret was a kind, middle-aged woman with glasses perched on her nose and a pen constantly in hand. She listened intently as Jamal read his letter aloud, her expression softening with each word. "Jamal," Margaret said gently, "this is one of the most heartfelt letters I've ever heard. Your dad is going to be so proud of you." Jamal's cheeks flushed, and he ducked his head shyly. Margaret worked quickly, crafting an article that highlighted Jamal's letter and the love he had for his father. When the article was published, it featured a photo of Jamal holding his letter, his wide eyes filled with hope. The headline read, "A Boy's Christmas Wish, a letter to Santa for his soldier dad." The response was overwhelming. Within hours, the Daily Chronicle received hundreds of emails and calls from readers touched by Jamal's story. Local businesses offered to donate supplies to the Hills, and a nearby school organized a care package drive for soldiers overseas. One call stood out above the rest. Linda, a representative from the Veterans Outreach Network, reached out with a proposal. "We'd like to help Jamal's letter reach his father," Linda said. "And if possible, we want to arrange something special. A live video call between Jamal and his father's unit on Christmas Eve." Nicole was speechless. When she shared the news with Jamal, he jumped up and down, his excitement palpable. "You mean I'll get to see Daddy?" he asked, his voice trembling. Nicole knelt down and hugged him tightly. "Yes, baby. You'll get to see him." As the plan unfolded, Bill found himself unexpectedly drawn into the preparations. Mrs. Whitaker insisted that he be involved, reminding him that redemption required action, not just apologies. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," Bill admitted one day as they decorated the mall's Santa's village. "Be present," Mrs. Whitaker said simply. "Show Jamal that you care. That's enough." Bill wasn't sure he believed her, but he stayed. By Christmas Eve, the mall was transformed. Volunteers had turned Santa's village into a winter wonderland, complete with twinkling lights, handmade ornaments, and a massive Christmas tree donated by a local nursery. As Jamal helped hang the final decorations, Bill approached him hesitantly. "Hey, kid," Bill said, his voice softer than usual. Jamal looked up, his expression curious. "I just wanted to say, you're a good kid," Bill said awkwardly. "And your dad's lucky to have a son like you." Jamal smiled. "Thanks, Santa." The story of Jamal's letter and his heartfelt Christmas wish spread far beyond the pages of the Daily Chronicle. By the day after its publication, it was circulating on social media, shared thousands of times. Comments poured in, messages of support, offers to help, and even letters from other children who shared their hopes for loved ones far away. Jamal's simple plea for his dad had touched a nerve in a world that was craving kindness and connection. Nicole's phone rang endlessly, with calls from local organizations, well-wishers, and even strangers offering to help. One call, however, stood out. A woman named Linda, representing the local chapter of the Veterans Outreach Network. "We were deeply moved by Jamal's story," Linda said. "We've been working with families like yours for years, and we'd like to help you connect with Sergeant Hill. We believe we can make this Christmas one to remember." Nicole, who had been holding back tears all day, finally let them fall. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This means the world to us." But Linda wasn't done. "We'd like to organize a live video call between Jamal and his father's unit. We've reached out to their base commander and they're on board. And we've also spoken to some community sponsors about making this a public event. Would you and Jamal be okay with that?" Nicole glanced at Jamal, who was quietly playing with his toys but kept looking back at the framed letter on the table. He had barely spoken since the story went public, overwhelmed by all the attention. Nicole knelt beside him. "Jamal," she said gently, "how would you like to see Daddy on Christmas Eve? Not just talk to him, but actually see him on a big screen." Jamal's eyes lit up, and he nodded enthusiastically. "Really? Can we really do that?" Nicole smiled, brushing his hair back. "Yes, baby. And we want everyone to know how much love you put into your letter. They'll all be there to cheer you on." With the event confirmed, preparations at the mall began in earnest. What had started as a simple Santa's village for photos was transformed into a full-scale holiday celebration. Volunteers from the community showed up in droves, stringing real garlands, setting up lights, and bringing in festive decorations. A local florist donated poinsettias to line the stage, and children from nearby schools contributed handmade ornaments to decorate the Christmas tree. A tech company offered to provide the equipment for the live video feed, ensuring that the connection would be flawless. Bill, still playing the role of Santa, watched in awe as the mall came alive with the energy of hundreds of people working together. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. "Looks good, doesn't it?" Mrs. Whitaker said, coming up beside him as he adjusted a string of lights. Bill nodded. "Better than good. It's amazing. All these people coming together for one kid. I didn't think people cared this much anymore." Mrs. Whitaker patted his shoulder. "Sometimes we just need a little reminder of what matters. And Jamal gave us that." The day before the big event, Nicole took Jamal to the mall to see the preparations. Jamal's eyes widened as they stepped into Santa's village. It looked like a scene from his favorite Christmas movies. Glittering snowflakes hung from the ceiling. The enormous Christmas tree sparkled with lights and handmade ornaments, and a choir rehearsed carols in the corner. "Wow," Jamal whispered. Bill, in his Santa costume, spotted them and walked over, his smile genuine. "Hey, Jamal, what do you think?" Jamal looked up at him, his face serious. "Did you do all this?" Bill chuckled, shaking his head. "Not just me. A lot of people helped. But I'm glad you like it." Jamal hesitated, then reached out and hugged Bill tightly. "Thank you, Santa." Bill froze for a moment, then slowly hugged him back. "You're welcome, kid. You deserve this." By Christmas Eve, the mall was buzzing with excitement. Families filled the space, their children bundled in festive sweaters and scarves, holding cups of hot cocoa. Santa's village had been turned into a stage, with rows of chairs set up in front of the giant screen. A choir sang carols, their harmonies echoing through the mall. Jamal arrived with Nicole and Mrs. Whitaker, his small hand clutching his mother's tightly. He wore his Sunday best, a neatly pressed shirt and slacks, and carried the framed letter tucked under his arm. "Are you nervous?" Nicole asked as they made their way to the stage. Jamal nodded. "A little. What if Daddy can't make it?" Mrs. Whitaker leaned down, her warm smile reassuring. "He'll be there. He wouldn't miss this for anything." Bill was waiting for them by the stage, his Santa suit immaculate. "Ready, Jamal?" he asked, his voice soft. Jamal took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." The event began with a performance by the choir, followed by a short speech from Margaret, who had written the original article. This story reminds us all of the power of love, hope, and the spirit of giving, she said, her voice carrying through the microphone. "And tonight, we're here to witness a very special Christmas wish come true." The lights dimmed, and the giant screen flickered to life. The crowd gasped as the image of a group of soldiers appeared, gathered in a decorated barracks. They waved at the camera, their smiles bright despite the distance. "There he is," Jamal shouted, pointing at the screen. Sergeant Marcus Hill stepped forward, his face filling the screen. His uniform was crisp, and his voice was warm as he said, "Hey, buddy. Merry Christmas." Jamal's heart raced as he stepped forward to the microphone. "Hi, Daddy. I wrote you a letter. Did you get it?" Marcus held up the letter, now laminated and well-worn, as if he had read it 100 times. "I got it, Jamal, and it's the best letter I've ever gotten. You don't know how much it means to me." Jamal beamed. "I miss you, Daddy. When are you coming home?" Marcus's voice softened. "Soon, buddy. Promise. But until then, I want you to know I'm always thinking of you. You're my little man, and I'm so proud of you." The crowd watched in silence, many wiping away tears. Nicole stood beside Jamal, her hand on his shoulder, her own eyes glistening with emotion. "I love you, Daddy," Jamal said, his voice strong despite the tears streaming down his cheeks. "I love you too, son," Marcus replied, his voice breaking. "More than anything." The screen faded to black, but the magic of the moment lingered. The crowd erupted into applause, cheering and clapping for Jamal, his father, and the incredible journey they had taken together. After the call, Jamal was surrounded by well-wishers. Strangers came up to shake his hand, offer him hugs, and tell him how much his story had meant to them. Nicole watched from the sidelines, her heart full as she saw her son light up with pride and joy. Bill stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold. For the first time in years, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had been part of something meaningful, something that had brought light into a world that often felt dark. "You did good, Bill," Mrs. Whitaker said, coming up beside him. Bill nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, feels good to care again." Mrs. Whitaker smiled. "That's the magic of Christmas." The night after the Christmas Eve event, the Hills apartment was filled with an atmosphere of peace and joy. Jamal couldn't stop replaying the moment he had seen his father's face on the screen. Even hours later, he sat on the couch with his mother, holding the framed letter that had started it all. "Do you think Daddy will come home soon?" Jamal asked, his voice quiet but hopeful. Nicole, seated beside him, brushed his curls gently. "I think he'll do everything he can to be here, and when he does, he'll know how much you love him." Jamal smiled, his face glowing with the quiet confidence of a child whose faith had been reaffirmed. The miracle of the night wasn't just that he'd spoken to his father. It was the knowledge that so many people had cared enough to make it happen. That same night, Bill sat alone in his small studio apartment. The space was sparsely decorated. A threadbare couch, a single bookshelf cluttered with dusty old notebooks, and a small artificial Christmas tree he had half-heartedly set up weeks ago. But tonight, the loneliness felt different. It wasn't as oppressive as it had been in years past. The events of the evening replayed in his mind: Jamal's beaming face, the way the crowd had cheered, the warmth of the boys' hug. For the first time in decades, Bill felt like he had been part of something bigger than himself. On his coffee table lay a notebook he hadn't opened in years. He stared at it for a long moment before picking it up and flipping through the pages. The scrawled beginnings of old stories filled the yellowed paper, ideas he had abandoned long ago. Bill found himself reaching for a pen. He didn't know what he wanted to write, but he knew he had to start somewhere. The day after Christmas, Jamal insisted on visiting Bill at the mall. Nicole agreed, and together they made their way to Santa's village, where the holiday decorations were still in place. The crowds had thinned now that Christmas was over, and Bill was tidying up the display, preparing for his final day in the suit. "Santa!" Jamal called, running up to him. Bill turned, a smile breaking across his face as he saw the boy. "Hey there, kid. What are you doing here?" "I wanted to say thank you again," Jamal said earnestly. "You made this the best Christmas ever." Bill knelt down, looking Jamal in the eye. "You don't need to thank me, Jamal. You're the one who made all of this happen. Your letter brought everyone together. I just helped a little." Jamal hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped package. "This is for you," he said, holding it out. Bill looked surprised but took the gift carefully. Unwrapping it, he found a simple ornament, a small glass globe with the word hope etched on it. "It's for your tree," Jamal explained, "so you don't forget that Christmas is about believing in people." Bill swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "Thanks, kid. This means a lot." Over the next few weeks, Bill found himself unexpectedly drawn into the Hills' lives. Nicole invited him to their apartment for dinner, where he sat at their small kitchen table and listened to stories about Marcus and Jamal's early years. "You're part of this now," Nicole told him one evening as she set a plate of food in front of him. "You've done so much for us, Bill. Your family." The word hit Bill harder than he expected. He hadn't been part of a family since Eleanor had passed, and he hadn't realized how much he missed it until now. Inspired by Jamal's letter, Bill threw himself into writing again. He started small, jotting down ideas and fragments of stories, but soon the words began to flow. One night, he found himself writing a story about a little boy who believed in the impossible. A boy whose love and determination reminded the world of what truly mattered. He titled it Jamal's Wish. Bill shared the story with Margaret, the journalist who had first covered Jamal's letter. She loved it and pitched it to the Daily Chronicle, which published it in their New Year's edition. The story quickly gained attention, with readers praising its heartfelt message and the way it captured the spirit of the holiday season. For the first time in years, Bill felt like his words mattered. In the spring, Marcus Hill returned home. The reunion at the airport was everything Jamal had dreamed of. His father swept him up into a tight hug, tears streaming down both their faces as they held each other. Nicole stood beside them, her own tears falling as she watched her family become whole again. Bill was there, standing off to the side, his Santa suit replaced with a simple jacket. Jamal ran to him after hugging his father, dragging him into the family embrace. "You're part of this too, Santa," Jamal said firmly. Bill laughed, his eyes misting. "Thanks, kid, but you can just call me Bill now." The next Christmas, the mall hosted an even bigger holiday event, inspired by the success of Jamal's story. Bill, now a celebrated local writer, was invited to read his story Jamal's Wish to a crowd of children and families. Jamal and his family were there too, seated in the front row, their smiles lighting up the room. As Bill read, he glanced up and caught Jamal's eye. The boy grinned and gave him a thumbs up, and for a moment, Bill felt like the luckiest man alive. Later that evening, Bill joined the Hills for Christmas dinner. The small apartment was filled with laughter and the smell of home-cooked food. Jamal sat beside his father, recounting every detail of their Christmas Eve event from the year before. After dinner, as the snow fell softly outside, Bill helped Jamal hang a new ornament on the tree, a small glass globe with the word family etched on it. "Merry Christmas, Santa," Jamal said, hugging him tightly. "Merry Christmas, kid," Bill replied, his heart full. Years later, Jamal's Wish became a beloved children's book, read in schools and homes every Christmas. Bill continued writing, his stories inspired by the people who had changed his life. Jamal grew up to follow in his father's footsteps, joining the military and dedicating himself to serving others. And every Christmas Eve, Bill and the Hills gathered together to celebrate the miracle that had brought them into each other's lives. A miracle sparked by one little boy's letter to Santa.